Methamphetamine, MDMA, cocaine, weed. We've done several stories about drugs lately, how it relates to homeless numbers, gambling, mental health, gangs, not to mention the Fijian HIV situation. So today on The Detail, we're out at Auckland Airport to dig deep into one part of the problem: illicit drug trafficking. What are border police looking for? Where is it coming from, and how do they stop it? I'm Davina Zimmer, and today I'm talking to Paul Williams, the Customs Manager at Auckland Airport.
New Zealand is being targeted quite heavily by overseas criminal groups, including cartels and criminal groups from around the world because of the profitability of drugs in New Zealand. So it's safe to say that Customs has seen an increase in the interceptions that we've had at the border, and that is largely driven around demand within New Zealand.
When he started out in Customs, Paul says drug trafficking was an occasional event, and when it happened, the substances were meticulously concealed in suitcases or on a person's body. But now, drugs are found in mail or cargo on the daily, and Paul says those doing the smuggling through the airport are no longer trying to hide it.
No concealment whatsoever. So we're seeing criminal groups using couriers, and you open up the bag and the drugs are sitting there. I liken that to a level of confidence. It's a confidence that they have with respect to what they're doing, and I expect that, like any business, they perhaps operate at a level of understanding what type of wastage or what type of level of drugs they may lose with respect to their efforts.
So in those cases where you've got someone who's come in and you literally open their bag and it's filled with meth,
Yep.
Could that potentially have been like a decoy?
That's always something that we're incredibly mindful of, but we operate in a layered approach with respect to how we target and how we look to sort of protect New Zealand. And so it's not just an officer in a booth. You know, we may have a dog operating, we'll have the targeting that sits in the background. We work really closely with partners like biosecurity in terms of X-ray screening. So I'm pretty confident that if that instance, for example, was a dummy, then presumably there'd be something else happening in and around the same time, and we haven't seen that. So at the moment we're walking through the baggage hall for Auckland International Airport, going against the grain of all the passengers, but we're heading towards what we refer to as the primary line, so it's the immigration line, and so that's where, you know, around sort of 70% of people will actually pass through an e-gate, electronic gate, rather than interacting with a customs officer before they come down to get their bags.
Although it's the first time passengers might interact with a customs officer, it may not be the first time customs officers have interacted with passengers. By law, airlines have to give their destination airport a list of passengers before they land. And Paul says a lot of work goes on behind the scenes to identify potential suspects before they even set foot here.
We work really closely with international partners around trends, observations, their own experiences, and that helps us look at people in advance through the data the airlines have, and then certainly on shore we have the ability to sort of run our eye over people, ask a few questions and make an assessment around whether or not they need a further search or not.
South America and Asia are hotspots for drug manufacturing, but that doesn't mean drugs are only found on people and luggage coming from those places.
The key thing to remember is that for New Zealand, you know, we receive multiple flights and multiple, you know, vessels and things like that from a host of different trade routes and passenger routes from around the world, and so criminal groups will always look to try to hide where things are coming from.
Do you get a spidey sense that something's up with someone, or are there, without profiling people, is there something that you look for?
Well, there's lots of things that we look for. I suppose the easiest way of putting it is every interaction we have, whether it is a successful one or not, it's a learning experience. And so officers do over time develop an ability to call crap, I suppose, when they have somebody in front of them that might not be telling the whole truth.
I know you can't probably talk about specific cases, but broadly speaking, what are some of the things that raise alarm bells for you when you're looking at an individual coming through?
Well, certainly people not knowing what it is they're going to be doing in New Zealand when they get here. It's not often that people arrive and they don't have some sort of plan. You do get the odd person that will turn up and will say, well, I'm going to Wellington and I'm going to catch an Uber or catch a taxi. So there hasn't really been that much thought and effort into what their backstory is. So we look at all sorts of things like that, the reasons for why they're here, what they plan on what to do.
Meth can be made here in New Zealand, and it is being made in New Zealand. So why do people choose to import it instead?
I think like with any type of manufacturing business, you have to think about the costs associated with setting up a manufacture process. There's obviously ingredients that are required to manufacture meth in the volume that New Zealand perhaps uses it. That would require reasonably large labs. The overseas criminal groups have that ability to manufacture on large scale in order to meet international demand. So I think it would be quite difficult for criminal groups, for example, to shift from importing a finished product to potentially trying to import multiple precursors to then try to manufacture it here in New Zealand.
And I mean, we've been talking about meth because that's the one that's been, I guess, in the news lately. I mean, we had the meth lollies last year.
Yeah.
What other drugs are there, though, coming through?
Cocaine is we've started seeing an increasing sort of trend in that. 2016, we had the 35 kilo of coke in the Diamante Horsehead.
A Mexican and an American have been handed down lengthy prison terms for their role in New Zealand's biggest ever cocaine bust. Police arrested them last year at Auckland Airport after authorities found 35 kilos of cocaine hidden inside a Diamante-encrusted horsehead imported from Mexico.
And that was, at the time, the largest cocaine intercept that we'd had. We've far surpassed that in terms of a single seizure now. I mean, just at Auckland Airport alone, we did have 101 kilo of cocaine come off one flight.
And I mean, obviously, the increase in drug trafficking comes down to the increase in demand. But why is there this increasing demand?
I don't know. I mean, look, for some reason, New Zealanders seem to be really willing to pay thousands and thousands of dollars for drugs. And like with any business enterprise, you look to take your product to where it's more marketable and more profitable. And where there's demand and a willingness to pay that money, that's where they will bring it.
Staff at New Zealand ports are busier than ever dealing with hidden narcotics imports.
New Zealand Customs seized more than 100 kilograms of cocaine,
50 kilograms of cocaine,
725 kilograms of the drug,
more than 3 tonnes of cocaine,
half a tonne of methamphetamine.
Customs has already seized more than 1.6 tonnes of cocaine, meth and MDMA between January and May this year. About a third of that was through the airport. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime says organised criminal networks are driving the illicit drug trade, with devastating consequences for people and communities around the world. It says stopping drug trafficking requires long-term coordinated action to address supply and demand, and to prevent organised criminal groups from exploiting vulnerabilities. So what does that look like in practice?
We've got a really strong focus on protection of New Zealand, right? So everything that we're doing now, Customs has always done. But what we are able to do on a year-on-year basis is get better. That being said, we look to invest heavily in our offshore footprint, where we put customs officers overseas. That is phenomenal in terms of positive feedback. So that relates to our offshore seizures, of which there's tons and tons of drugs avoided coming to New Zealand.
And so that is to just catch it before people even hop on the plane to come here.
Yeah, ideally. It's a win for the Overseas Administration, and it's a real win for New Zealand because, of course, just purely from a fiscal perspective, you don't have a court process, you don't have that lead-in time to the court process, you don't have drugs that you have to store and then eventually, dispose of. You don't run the risk of the drugs actually entering into society and then having all the actual harm that comes from the consumption of those drugs. We'll walk down?
Yep, let's go. Aside from drugs, what other items are you finding people are trying to bring in from overseas?
Certainly here at the airport we see all sorts of things from controlled medicines through to weapons. They're not necessarily weapons that have been brought in by criminal actors looking to use them. By and large, they are general Joe public that has travelled overseas and have seen something they think is really cool. I think what we see more often is, with many people, a inability to follow a process or stick with regulation. So firearms, for example, we'll have legitimate travellers looking to legitimately bring firearms to New Zealand for sporting purposes, and they just may not have gone through the right process to obtaining the permit on arrival. And what that unfortunately means is the firearm itself ends up being forfeit, and we then seize it.
Now we're on our way to the viewing room that overlooks the baggage search area where passengers get their luggage checked.
Is this the area that would probably get frequented on shows like Border Patrol and Border Security?
Yeah, 100%. This is what we refer to as our secondary intervention area, our secondary search area. Passengers will be directed down here that have been identified as a risk or will have identified themselves, self-declared, that they have something for customs. We'll go through an initial what are you here for process, and then those that are needing a further interaction in terms of a baggage search and further questioning will push through into the main part of the search area here. We get a lot of people that self-declare everything from prescription medicines through to making sure that they're doing the right thing in terms of how many cigarettes or tobacco they've got and alcohol.
And they still come through here and get their bags searched?
Generally speaking,
Yeah.
well, no. Generally speaking, if they can show us, for example, they've got what they've got, and there's nothing else to indicate that we need to look at them, we won't.
Okay.
So the easiest thing to sort of describe it is we might interact with 5 or 6% of people that might come down and have an initial conversation. Majority of them all go back out again. They'll go through the process and they'll go out. Okay. In terms of the people that we get in here to search, it's generally less than 1% of the total arriving population across New Zealand.
And so how do the people who just have a conversation, is that decision made, obviously they show you what they've got, is that decision then just made based off trust and gut feeling that you know they don't have any more?
Yeah, there's certain things that officers will know that are a little bit more hinky or deserve a little bit more testing. But generally speaking, through the good questioning that an officer does with the information that's presented in front of them, they'll make a decision or a determination. That being said, we don't just leave officers to make every decision themselves either. We do have more senior officers there that are able to sort of provide additional advice or guidance in terms of the decision-making process.
What happens if you find something?
Depends on what we find. Yeah. So if we identify, for argument's sake, it's drugs, obviously the very first thing that we do is we need to secure those drugs, and we look to identify what it is that we're dealing with. Health and safety is a really, really big focus here in the search area. Officers are always wearing gloves, and at a time where the risk elevates, they are required to put on N95 masks as well if we're dealing with an unknown substance. So we go through a sort of a test and secure process, and then we work through an established process with respect to that passenger and what we might do with them. If it's another commodity or another thing, if we have a person that might present more of a risk with respect to child exploitation, and we have digital devices, then we will go through a process with respect to how we search those devices for the offending material, at which point we find something, we stop. There's people that we can call, experts that can actually come in and help us. We secure the device itself, and then we go through another type of process with the passenger.
In a lot of cases, those passing through this search area are people who've said they have something to declare, just to be on the safe side.
People are risk adverse when you cross the border, and so you go, I don't want to get in trouble, so I'm going to declare it. I probably don't have to declare it, but I'll declare it.
Just declare it anyway.
Yeah, and it's good, but equally, we would much prefer that the traveller is really clear on understanding what they can and can't bring, because then they can make the right declaration, which means they can go down the right pathway. Because the more people are risk adverse and they're declaring something they don't need to declare, the longer it takes as well to actually get through.
That's true.
You know, and,
Clogs up your system.
well, yeah, you know, and we do have a finite resource, and there's lots of stuff here that we do at the airport. There's the search piece and the risk assessment, and then there's, you know, primary line in processing people crossing the border or departing. But, you know, we will attend military aircraft out of Whanautai. If we have a passenger that's had a medical event on the plane, we will go up and we'll attend the plane. There are private aircraft that operate out of Auckland Airport that we will attend to. We now have a team that deploys to Hamilton to process the arrival.
Of course, because they just started international flights.
Yeah, so you know, there's a whole host of things that we do here that pushes and pulls on the resource that we have. So it really does come down to making sure we've got an agile workforce and making the right decisions using the right information at the time. And so sometimes that might mean there's a bit of a delay in one part because we've got to deal with something else, but we try to avoid that wherever we can.
Obviously, they can't catch everything that's pouring through.
Even in the times that we don't get something and we learn about it afterwards, we do have a real good close look at, okay, so what happened and why did that happen? And then we sort of push that back into staff and we push it back into the relevant process so that we get better and we get the next one.
What have been the biggest things that have changed? Both you guys catching, but also the offenders bringing stuff in.
Well, the biggest thing that I've really had to come to grips with in the last couple of years is sort of two things. The first thing is the size or the quantity of the drugs that we're getting in one hit here at the airport. Very, very different to what we were getting back when I was on the floor. You know, we were lucky if we had a couple of kilo. I can remember the strip search of one gentleman, and he had, you know, I think it was only a couple of kilo of methamphetamine strapped to his body. And I've had staff that have had concealments within suitcases. You know, you might get up to sort of 1.5, 2 kilo again. Now, as I mentioned, you know, we are finding 7, 8, 10, 15, 20 kilo of meth or coke, sometimes both, on a passenger or in a bag. So that's one of the big things that's changed. And then, yeah, certainly recently the manner in which Customs has changed its approach. So we have really evolved in our thinking and understanding and our desire to work with stakeholders and partners. So we recognise that Customs is just one part of quite a wide spectrum. So we do a lot where we work closely with industry.
So industry being importer companies?
Importing, exporting.
Yep.
So we've done a lot in the export space in terms of exporters, so helping protect the primary exporters of New Zealand, helping them secure their supply chain a bit more, and then they sort of get trade-offs and through the Authorised Economic Operator Program. It's a World Customs Organisation initiative, faster access to market, essentially overseas. So it's really, really good for our people. But on the importer side of things, we go out and we work really closely with, you know, DHL, FedEx, a host of other facilitators of imported goods. And we look to educate them on what it is that we see at the border, and we talk to them about exploitation. We talk to them about vulnerabilities within the supply chain. And the more that they understand how the supply chain works and where the vulnerabilities are, the more they are attuned to what's going on. And that then results in them talking to us. And they can often come to us and say, we think we've got an issue here, and we'll go in and we'll help them.
What's the weirdest thing you've come across?
It was a long time ago, and I don't think it's ever happened again. The officer came over to me after sort of getting partway through a search and said, "Oh, boss, I think I've got something." I'm like, "Okay, well, what do you think you've got?" Because he says he's got eggs. I'm like, "Oh, what, eggs?" He's like, "Yeah, parrot eggs." Long story short, this gentleman had 44 parrot's eggs strapped to his body that he'd carried all the way from South Africa to New Zealand across a couple of flights. And each egg was tucked into a little pocket that had been sewn on to like a T-shirt. So it had been purposely sewn.
He was a bit like a mother hen there.
He absolutely was, because we were sitting at the bench actually talking about rugby. and giving each other a bit of stick about All Blacks versus South Africa. And he said, one's hatched. And I kind of called him on it and said, oh, yeah, right. And he said, no, listen. And yet, sure enough, you could hear one of the parrots chirping.
Did he ever say why he...
Again,
I mean,
it's money.
It seems like
It's money.
So he brought them in to sell them.
Yep.
Really?
Yeah, because for many, many years there's been a reasonably strong black market for wildlife.
Wow.
As well as there is overseas, and so we would often get travellers that would come to New Zealand and would go out hiking and tramping with the explicit purpose of trying to catch some of our local wildlife.
Really? So is that something that you're noticing is becoming more frequent? Or?
Haven't seen it for a very, very long time. It's not to say it wouldn't have happened. It wouldn't surprise me if there's still a little bit of that going on.
How was the flight? Was it okay?
You know what? There was a lot of turbulence.
Arrest me. No.
You've probably watched Border Patrol at some stage. I asked Paul if the program is true to life.
Yeah, it's accurate in the sense that that's what happens at an airport. But what Border Patrol doesn't show you is the breadth of what Customs actually does. You know, the airport and things like the mail centre are just very, very small parts of an organisation that has multiple touch points. Everything from free trade agreements and supporting the government of the day and negotiations around those, through to that overseas presence where we work with international partners. We do a lot in the Pacific, sort of working with our Pacific customs administrations and their systems and their processes and how they look at things and target, through to what we do in the maritime space, our presence on seaports. Obviously we have dogs. We do everything from financial crime through to child exploitation, to drugs, to tobacco, to weapons. There's a whole host of things that Customs does to support, sort of protection of New Zealand.
That's all for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and NZ On Air. Thank you to Paul Williams. This episode was produced by Alexia Russell and engineered by Ben Pearce. I'm Davina Zimmer. Ka kite.